Well, hello, this is Pastor Brandon Mason, Senior Pastor of the Locust Ridge Church, and I am excited about tonight. We've had a lot of people who have lost loved ones, and not only loved ones, but lost a lot of things in life during this pandemic season. And so I believe it's the church's responsibility to come together and show people, number one, that it's okay to grieve. It's all right. It's okay to grieve. But I also know that there's a healthy way to grieve. So here's what I want you to do. I need for you to share this live experience tonight. We're going to heal some people tonight. That is our ultimate agenda tonight, is that we're going to heal tonight. So I want you to get the word out, share. You're also welcome to engage with us. Lift your questions throughout the presentation, and we're going to do the very best we can to answer as many questions as possible. But I am excited tonight that we have from Alive Hospice here in Nashville, Tennessee, Miss Teresa Yarbrough, grief counselor from Alive Hospice, and I'm excited to have her with us tonight. She's going to present to us here at the Locust Ridge Church and the nation abroad, because so many of you are already tuned in with these numbers, and we're excited to have you tonight. And so I'm going to turn it over to her. She's going to tell you about herself, about what she does, and then we're going to start this virtual grief counseling session. We're going to navigate through grief tonight. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Locust Ridge Church. Our Facebook family, our internet family is with us tonight, and so I'm going to turn it over to you. You can start. You can start.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm really honored and grateful to be here tonight. A little bit about myself. I've worked for Alive Hospice for 21 and a half years. Alive Hospice is the third oldest hospice in the nation, and I started in the year 2000 as a nurse primarily. We opened our facility in Nashville in July of 2000. I started in August, and not long after that I started on my days off doing support groups, grief support groups. And so I've done both the whole time I've worked with Alive Hospice, almost the whole time. And then the last several years I flipped, and I'm doing the grief counseling full time, and I'm doing my nursing on my days off from my grief counseling. So I'm very familiar with the dying process as a nurse and the grief process as a counselor. And we offer a wide variety of support for families and friends of people in our community that have had a loss by death. And your pastor is going to have some things available for you Sunday morning that are resources. We'll go over some of those things tonight, and then the others you'll just have at home for you so that you can have something like a toolbox. One of the things that grief does for us is change all sorts of aspects of our life, and we can be sleeping all the time, we can be awake a lot, so it's hard to find ways to fill our time whenever we're alone and sad. So we really love to offer different kinds of support, and that's part of what what your pastor is going to share with you on Sunday. We also have 5 different counseling offices in the greater Middle Tennessee area. We have one in Murfreesboro, one in Franklin, one in Hendersonville, in Lebanon, and in Nashville. And we're doing everything by phone or by Zoom virtually right now for everyone's safety. And another thing that he's going to offer you is our March calendar of events. So we have a lot of groups that we're doing online, as well as one-on-one counseling. So I just want you to know that that's available for you. And then we'll just go ahead and get started and talk about grief in general. Please don't hesitate to ask questions, and we can just begin to have a conversation. One of the things that is important to know about grief is that it's a very personal experience, and it depends very much. What my grief is going to look like may look very different from what your grief looks like, and that's because I'm a different person. and my relationship with the person that died is different than anyone else's. My, however many losses we've had, an experience of loss is going to affect how we grieve. So even in family units, even in friend units, people will grieve differently, in different paces and different characteristics, and that's just what grief looks like for all of us. It can also, because it's very multifaceted, it can affect pretty much every part of who we are. It affects us physically, psychologically, spiritually, interpersonally, and behaviorally. And although it's commonly associated with the death of someone that we love, there can be a lot of different losses that affect us deeply. And so if we have a loss by death, and then we have a secondary loss of maybe a job, or maybe our home is in jeopardy because our person that died was the breadwinner, and now we're concerned about our finances. There are just a lot of different ways that grief and death can affect us. It's associated with a lot of emotional and physical symptoms that includes shock and numbness and sadness, despair, loneliness, isolation, feeling a yearning for a person that died, feeling a yearning for the life we had before the death. We can be really angry. We can have a lot of difficulty concentrating. It's actually called grief fog, similar to chemo fog. Have a lot of forgetfulness and being really irritable. We may have been a real mellow person before this death occurred, and now we are just losing our temper all the time. And it doesn't really make sense to us because it feels like it's not our normal personality, but it's not uncommon whenever we have a significant loss in our life for our capacity for being patient, or keeping our temper managed well, for that to just go out the window. We can struggle with feeling like we can't stay awake, sleeping all the time, or else we can be awake all the time, a lot of insomnia. Same thing about appetite. We can either find comfort in eating, or we're just feel so distraught that we can't even find the energy or the interest to eat. We can have all sorts of aches and pains. We can be frustrated. We can feel worried. We can feel anxious. We can feel detached or frustrated. We can begin to question our faith. We can begin to question our worldview. Pretty much anything. I tell folks all the time, whatever feels like it's not really working in your life, just blame it on your grief, because it affects every part of who we are. So what's important for us in grief, knowing that it's going to affect so much of who we are, is to learn ways to cope with it that fits who we are and that fits the loss that we've experienced. When we can either avoid or have negative coping, which is not the best choice. Those are the kinds of things like using drugs or alcohol that can complicate our grief and increase the duration and the intensity of our painful emotions. We always grieve in some way at some point in our life, even though the intensity of our grief will lessen over time. It will look and feel different over time. There will be some positive changes in our perspective, and fostering a continuing bond with the person that died will be helpful for us to find comfort and warmth in that. While things like additional losses, life stressors, or significant days or anniversaries may actually temporarily make things harder for us. Grief is not a linear experience. It's not like we go into kindergarten, we go through all the way through 12th grade, we graduate, we get a diploma, and we're done. It's not like that at all. It's very cyclical, like the seasons of the year. It's very unpredictable. We can have setbacks. We can have breakthroughs. We can have roadblocks. We can have triggers, and then we can have some resolutions to really hard days. And things can occur in real unpredictable times and for irregular durations, for the days, months, and the years after the death. It's normal to feel like we've taken one step forward and two steps back. It's not uncommon to have twists and turns. It's normal to have bad days even years later. Not all of our days will be bad years later, but we may have a bad day intermittently. It may be triggered by a scent that reminds us of our person that died. It may be triggered by an anniversary. It may be triggered by Father's Day, Mother's Day, your birthday. It may be the first birthday you've had without your mom alive. Maybe your first Father's Day without your dad alive. All of those things will be triggers. And we can learn how to cope with those. We can learn ways to put things in place so that those days are not as upsetting for us and they don't throw us for quite so much of a loop. The unpredictability can be tough for those of us who like to know what to expect. But don't be discouraged. We can expect the feelings associated with grief to become less intense with time. We can't really tell when we'll feel better, but we know that eventually we will feel better. I'm going to put my glasses on. There are a few factors that can impact the length and intensity of our grief. One is the type of coping we choose, like I said earlier. If we choose negative coping to avoid or numb our thoughts or feelings of guilt or grief, that's going to make everything more complicated. Also, as you might expect, things that we may already have in place before we have experienced a death, like an anxiety disorder or a mood disorder or even a post-traumatic stress disorder, can be complicated when we have a grief and a loss. So one of the ways to consider grief is the kinds of grief that we're having. For instance, an anticipatory grief is whenever we know something is going to happen. If we have someone that we love deeply and we know that they've been diagnosed with a terminal or life-limiting illness, we begin to grieve at the time of the diagnosis. And we begin to have symptoms of grief that's real similar to the grief after the death. We can feel anger. We can feel like our emotions are out of control. We can feel sadness despite the fact that our person is still alive right now. And this type of grief can occur before the death, can be confusing. And we may feel conflicted or guilty about grieving someone that's still living, that's right here with us. We might also be surprised by the relief that we feel after someone dies, but it's a relief because they're not in pain and distress anymore, but we can still feel guilty about that. We can have inhibited grief when we sort of numb ourselves and push away the grief. The challenges with this is that it might possibly lead to physical manifestations or different emotional isolation or depression. We can have ambiguous grief, which means that if there's any kind of a confusion about what's been lost or what the loss was, for instance, if someone that we love really deeply is having some altered personality or having some mental illness. And that can make things more complicated for us. We can have disenfranchised grief. That's whenever something in our culture, our society, or our support system makes folks feel like their loss or their grief is insignificant or invalid. This type of grief can occur whenever the death is stigmatized by society, such as a death by suicide or overdose, maybe an HIV or an AIDS death, maybe drunk driving related death, maybe a same-sex partner or a gang member, a relationship with a person that's seen as unimportant. For instance, a lot of times a miscarriage is considered a disenfranchised grief because the baby was not born alive and there wasn't supposedly a relationship. but it's still incredibly grievous for those that love the baby, the parents, and all the family members. Another loss that can be disenfranchised is not necessarily a death, but like if someone has dementia, then we're grieving them. We're grieving the loss of the person that we've known, someone that maybe had a traumatic brain injury, has mental illness, or a type of addiction that takes them away from relationship with us. A delayed grief occurs when our grief symptoms aren't experienced until long after. And then cumulative grief is one of the things that the pastor was talking about, where we can be experiencing one loss and then we have another death or another additional kind of loss. And a secondary loss is what I referred to earlier. And whenever we may have all sorts of things. Whenever I do my grief groups, whenever we're all together, I'll get a big whiteboard and I'll divide everything up into physical and mental and emotional and spiritual and even occupational, and let everybody in the group tell me what's happening in their world. And by the time everyone in the group has talked, the whole whiteboard is full, because that's how many ways grief can look to us and show up in our lives. And the same is true as far as secondary loss. Often a loss sets off a domino effect of change, adjustment, and additional losses. And on top of the need to cope with the loss of the person that we love, we also have to adjust to things that have altered. And we may not have even realized that that was going to happen until it starts happening. So we may have a loss of a business, maybe a loss of an identity, a loss of community, a loss of self-confidence. It could be a loss of relational identity. Am I still a wife? Am I still a parent? Am I still a daughter after my parents die? Especially with spouses, there's a loss of physical and emotional intimacy. That's a really challenging, sad, lonely loss. Feels like I've been talking a lot. Are there questions so far?
So, as of now, we have not received any questions
Okay.
yet.
Well, we can
But
keep talking.
please, sir, please, ma'am, we have some time to, if anyone wants to lift up questions, we're watching right on the live. I'm watching, our media team is watching, and we're going to get your questions answered the best way possible. But please, sir, please, ma'am, go on and type your questions in the chat, and we'll get it answered.
Okay. Well, I'd like to go ahead and there are a lot of books that are really helpful in the grieving process. There are 2 different books that are daily meditation readers that just will have, they're sort of like if any of you have the Jesus Calling book, where it opens with a little scripture and then has a little paragraph of encouragement, and we'll close with a little quote. That's what these books are about. One is called Healing After Loss. It's more Christian oriented. The other one is called Grief One Day at a Time, and it's not Christian oriented. It's not as focused specifically for a Christian faith, but they're both very helpful to help normalize our grief for us and help us realize that we're not alone and that we're not crazy, because so many different aspects of grief that cause us to feel unbalanced and out of our normal space of feeling comfortable can really cause us to question whether or not we're still mentally stable, which can be challenging. That's another thing that's helpful about being in a grief group, is being able to hear our story and someone else's story to help us realize that we're not alone. So Alive Hospice offers 8-week-long grief groups year-round. This week is the last of one, and then we have another one starting next week. We'll have one in May. We'll have one year-round. So it's really helpful. We have groups that are specific for spouse loss, and then we also have some that are specific for what we call loss of loved one, which just means it would be the loss of a parent, a grandparent, a sibling or a child or a friend, a good friend, would fit in that category.
All right, we have some questions. We have
Oh,
some
great.
questions come in. We have some questions come in. All right, the first question is, how long does the grieving process last?
So that goes back to how unique each one of us grieve. So I have been with people that feel like their grieving process is less intense after 6 months. I've have people that I sit with that their grieving process is still really intense at year one. My grandmother, which I'm just going to quote her, but I don't agree with her. She really struggled after my granddad died, and she became very reclusive, which I think is part of what lengthened her grief time, because she had always been very, very social and became very isolated. And she was confident that because it lasted 2 years for her, that no one else was going to get better but until 2 years. But that's not really true. However, some people do feel like that their second year is harder than their first. More often than not, people feel like by the time they hit every milestone of their first year, their first holidays, their first anniversary, their first birthday, all those kinds of firsts, that for the most part they have learned some good skills and they've got some healing under their belt, and they're able to step into the world that's so different, in their person that's so different than they were before the death.
Gotcha. So it kind of sounds like it's 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 an individual thing.
It is.
It's personal, personal experiences.
Yes.
Um, and I would go on to say, um, don't try to give yourself a deadline to stop grieving. I believe if you love anyone, you're gonna miss them a lot. I think you just learn how to manage it, and you learn how to heal with it. So good question. Good question. The next question, gentleman says, I've lost a dad and two brothers in the last 14 months. What sort of regimen would you recommend for me?
Well, that's a lot. That's a lot in a short period of time. Um, so I would recommend trying to get as much support as you can, whatever that looks like for you. If that means being in a support group, and also a lot of churches have a program called Grief Share. That's a 12-week group, and some of those are virtual online, and some of them are meeting in person. And that's a combination of discussion and videos and sort of a workbook. And a lot of people have found that really helpful, even if it's just to get out of the house and or to hear one another's stories. It's just so challenging if we isolate and we become reclusive. I feel like that we heal in community. We can often be wounded by ourselves, but we heal so much better in community. Um, Also, I would just recommend you, getting a book. There's a lot of resources online as well, and the pastor's going to give you some of those resources that you can just look up and find things like journaling or grief through photography, but I would say mostly to not isolate and be with people. A lot of times people find a lot of help in finding someone that has had a similar loss. A lot of my widows and widowers will go and seek out people that have had a spouse loss so that they can learn from them. If it was 16 years ago, if it was 16 months ago, they've got some strength and they've got some experience and hope that they can share. So those are the things I would recommend for you.
Well, I love what you said with that. We heal in community. In other words, we're definitely better together, and I believe isolation is a tool of the enemy. Um, there are times where I just want to be by myself. I want to, and that's good. Screen by yourself, seclude yourself, do what you got to do. but I do understand that. But I think also there has come a time where again you do get out and understand that we are community. We are to live together, cry together. Um, Losing a dad and two brothers in the last 14 months can be a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot. And so my brother, we're definitely praying for you. Next question. In the grief process, at what point do I seek professional counseling? In the grief process, at what point do I seek professional counseling?
Well, that's a great question. And I would say I have people come to see me a week after the death. I have people come to see me 3 years after the death. I would say if you're feeling like you've been in the same spot where you can't function even at a normal level or even at a lesser level, and that's been going on for some months, I would recommend some assistance. Um, and and there's no reason to even wait that long. There's just real benefit in being able to talk about our person. It's just huge. That lets us keep our relationship with that person as vital and vibrant and ongoing as we can, just to talk about them. Sometimes, whenever we're grieving, we have a tendency to not talk about our person, either because we're protecting someone else that's also grieving, or maybe we're having people tell us how we should and shouldn't grieve, and we're not. That's not really helping us. So we get quiet and quieter and quieter. It's really helpful to keep talking. It's really helpful to keep moving. And and I think that especially with us, we have grief counseling available all the time. And so a lot of times people just have a session with me once a month or once a week for a while, because I give them a full hour of them talking about their person, let them cry, let them shout if they need to, let them tell me all the different people that are telling them things that they are not helpful for them. So I highly recommend just more resources, and if that includes counseling for you, it's a high recommendation on my list.
Thank you. And since we're in a church setting, if you will, I think I have to say this because a lot of people um, have experienced this. There are a lot of people that believe, oh, if you go to therapy or counseling, that's a sign that you don't have faith. That's a sign that you don't trust God. And that is absolutely not true. Um, I believe that theology and therapy go together. I believe we need God and counseling. And sometimes even step further. This is not this setting, but even in the mental health realm, um, medicine is needed in some cases. And so I believe that the church has misconstrued this to say, hey, all you need is prayer. No, sometimes I need more than prayer. No, sometimes I need to talk to somebody professional. And if there are some, and I see some pastors online, some pastors and ministers, let me share with you, um, you got to understand, you got to be confident in you enough to say, hey, this is beyond me. Because a lot of pastors will try to wear the S on the chest and say, hey, I have every answer, and we don't. There are some answers we just don't have, and people need professional counsel. They need professional help. And so pastors and leaders, don't be afraid to send your people to set up with agencies and grief counselors and therapists. Um, I believe everybody needs a therapist, period. Whether you're grieving or not, everybody needs somewhere you can just go dump all this on. Because life gets hard, life gets stressful, and even if you're the strongest person, I hear somebody saying, I'm the strongest person. Yeah, but now where does the strongest person go when they got to dump on somebody? And so too much, it's like if you shake up a bottle of Coke after a while, it's going to explode.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't get that, how you're going to explode on your children, on your marriage, you're going to explode on innocent people, you're going to explode in your work. And it's not that you're a bad person, it's just you've had enough. And
Mm-hmm.
so you have to find healthy ways to get it out. And so thank you so much for lifting that question. Yes, professional counseling is needed. Here's the next question, and this is a twofold question. Is it normal to have trust issues during grieving? And then the next question is the same person. And is it normal to seem like you are just out of body sometimes? So is it normal to have trust issues? And then is it normal to just seem like I ain't there? Yeah, I'm just my body's here, but my mind's across town. I'm just not here.
Yes, yes, and yes. Both of those are an answer to both of those questions. Or yes, it's just not uncommon to feel completely disoriented and be driving down the highway. You don't remember where to get off, and you've driven the same road for 15 years. Um, it's those are just common things, or to find something in the cabinet that should have been in the refrigerator, or you can't remember what you're supposed to do at 2 o'clock, even though it's the same thing you've done every Tuesday afternoon for years on end. Those are all really normal things, and that's what I was talking about, calling it a grief fog, feeling really disoriented and forgetful. It's challenging to for folks to get back to work after they've experienced someone's death, especially if it's a job that requires a lot of cognitive skill, like an engineer or a pharmacist or a lawyer. Even people that work with computers a lot really are challenged going back to work because our heads are just not clear yet, and it takes some time. Um, and I'm sorry, I forgot the first one. I was
Is it
scheduling.
normal to have trust issues?
Yes, the trust issues. Yes, that's really very common. In fact, it's common to begin to fear our close friends and family, maybe that they're going to die, and feeling unstable in just our world view, our stability in knowing that good is going to be good tomorrow, because it doesn't feel good today. Whenever we're hurting so deeply and our world has turned upside down and we don't even know how to take the next step, it's real common to just feel unstable in every area. And trust is huge in that regard.
Here's another. It's more of a comment, and it's more of a comment. Someone says, I do remember when my spouse died. The next day, I had a test scheduled. I kept the appointment, but as I filled out the paperwork, I sat there for 30 minutes before the lady asked me if I needed help. Here it is. I couldn't bring myself to mark the box that said widow. For months, I still couldn't mark this box. Do you have any
Yeah,
comments on that?
that's really true. It's so hard to step into that and step away from where we've been our whole lives, whatever it is. Um, and every time we have to say it out loud, every time we have to write it down with our words, and you know, like that, at a bank or at a doctor's appointment, or even on the phone, whenever we get scam calls, if you answer those, and they ask for a person that's died. Sometimes people will just rage on the phone and say they're dead and just all sorts of stuff, or else they'll just falter because they can't form the words. It's too painful. And it takes a good while. And it can happen 6 months later after you've had all sorts of things that you've taken care of. If you haven't had to say it in a while, it can be really challenging. If you get a phone call from someone that you're not in touch with very often, and they ask about your person, and you realize, oh, they don't know that my person died, and you have to say it out loud, and which also brings with it all the history and circumstances and everything. It's the story. It can be really traumatic.
So it's if you will, the trauma of the new norm.
Yes.
Is the new norm. Um, and that's at that point it's so fresh that you don't want to accept it.
Mm-hmm.
But when you had to check that box, it's like you saying, "Oh, this is for real."
Right.
Like even if I don't want to accept it mentally, physically, I'm having to do this. I've sat in many funeral homes making arrangements with families as pastor and a professional working at a funeral home, and people are good up until the point that they have to sign a death certificate. At signing that death certificate, I've seen it so many times because that's almost like a like I'm here for real now, and I'm here for me. So I have seen that. I've noticed that. You're so right. You're so right. Here's the next one.
And can I just say, one of the
Yes.
things that's challenging is we can't predict what that final point is that's going to make it real for us. I had one gentleman in my grief group whose wife was one of those that do the meal planning, and she had done 30 meals in the freezer. They were all in there, and because she was fairly functional before she died. And so after her death, he was just going to the freezer and getting a meal out and cooking it. And when he went to the last one, it was like it hit him in the face. My wife is dead.
Wow. Oh
You know,
wow.
it's just whatever. It's different for each one of us whenever that reality hits us.
Wow. Here's another one, and I think is a great question. And I think we often overlook this one a lot. I think we overlook this. What advice do you have for supporting small children during the grieving process? So, what advice do you have for supporting small children during the grieving process?
And that's a great question. I will say that we have a lot of support for children at Alive Hospice. We have a camp for kids in the summer, and we have a youth camp year round, and all of our counselors are able and equipped to see children. And one of the things that's helpful is to normalize death for children and not push it away. There are a lot of books that are really helpful for children. There's that just talk about. There's a book called Lifetimes. It's a beautiful way to explain death to small children. That's one of the books that's really great. There's a book called The Invisible String, talking about how we can still be connected to people that we're not close to anymore, even if they live on the other side of the world or if they live in heaven, because of our love for one another. But normalizing the fact that death is normal and natural and expected and not to be feared and not to be ignored and not to be hidden from is helpful for children. Children learn from us how to grieve. They learn from us how to do everything. So if we hide from them whenever we're grieving, they're going to think there's something wrong with being sad. They're going to think there's something wrong with crying after someone dies. But if we're willing to be vulnerable with the children and let them know that, yes, I'm sad that your daddy died, and then let them know that that happens, that it, and help them know that it's just because it happened to daddy doesn't mean absolutely that it's going to happen to mom or to grandmother or any of those kinds of things, but to not deny that it's reality and to offer comfort, offer as many times as they need to cry, as many times as they need to ask questions, as many times as they need to snuggle to find comfort in their sadness.
Thank you. I love that you said making it understand that it's reality. Making children understand that it's human to grieve. If we hide grief from them when they become adults, they don't know how to grieve healthy.
Right.
And so I think that's one problem that we've had in generations past. Um, if we've taught our kids anything, we've taught them isolation, stay to yourself, grieve to yourself, don't let nobody see you cry. And so when they become adults, this is what they do, and it keeps on passing from generation to generation. But I love what you said. Let them know that it's reality. Let them know that it's human to grieve. I mean, even when we look at the biblical text, Even I'm not preaching tonight, but even Jesus himself lets us know that it's okay to grieve. Jesus goes to Bethany while he's there. His friend Lazarus is dead. Jesus goes to the grave, and the Bible says, and Jesus wept. Jesus cried. Jesus grieved.
Yes.
And so letting children know that it's all right. Again, we struggle with, should I let them go to the funeral or should I not? Should I take them or should I not? Letting them see that it's natural. Now they don't need to be exposed to just everything. Again, it's steps and stages. Just not completely. But yes, what an amazing question. What an amazing answer. I loved it.
Well, and we, in the Western culture, we've removed death from our normal experience. So, that's one of the things I love about hospice at home is that even children are part of the experience of the death because it's in their home. And it's not as fearful that way. If children are never allowed to be around things that are challenging and hard to deal with, they'll grow up and not know how to deal with things that are challenging and hard instead of accepting them as part of what's normal and natural in life.
All right. The next question. Here's another question. Someone says, I felt so much anger when my husband died that the world was not grieving with me. Is this uncommon? She says that while she felt angry because when her husband died, it seemed like the world was not grieving with her. I see the picture. You're stuck, but watching everybody else walk
Yes,
by.
yeah.
You're sitting in the middle of a busy street, just stuck and paused, and everybody's life is still going past you, and you're angry. Like, slow down.
Right.
Grieve with me.
Yeah, that's very true, and it's really common. It's in a lot of the literature, and it's in a lot of people's stories whenever they talk about feeling like the world is going on without them, and why can't you see that that I am grieving here? Can you tell that my heart is breaking because my person died? It's very, very common, and again, that's another good reason to surround yourself with people. Like if you were able to find, speaking to this woman, if you were able to find someone in your circle of friends that has been a widow for some time, that widow would most likely be able to relate to that because it's a common experience. I wonder are there a lot of questions? I have a thing to
Okay,
read.
so I just have one more question,
Okay.
then we'll go right back to you.
Yeah.
Okay, so another question is, how do you learn to separate the grief and guilt with your relationship with God?
Well, that's a good one. That's really good. And I would say that God can handle it. I feel like if we read through the Psalms and all the times that the different psalmists, whether it was Moses or David, that were wailing and weeping and very upset about their own losses and wrestling with God over those things. And I can imagine that, just like the pastor said, that Jesus grieved over his friend's death. And so I don't want to be so theological that I take away the reality of the fact that it's hard whenever we are so sad and feel so lonely and feel so bereft that we feel abandoned by God. And I trust that God is big enough to be told, I feel abandoned by you. Can you show up for me? And a lot of times I'll have to say, God shows up in community. Not always, but especially in community when people have already had a grief experience themselves. They know what it's like to feel alone. They know what it's like to feel like they don't fit anymore in a couple setting. They may not feel like they fit in a church setting anymore. Um, those are all hard issues to wrestle with. And I would encourage anyone to know that it's worth wrestling with, and your faith is worth wrestling for. Um, and I believe you'd be able to find some people that could relate to that with you.
Yes, yes. I agree. I agree. And one thing you said, I believe you hit it on the nose, is that Jesus is that God is big enough to handle your questions. God is big enough to handle your anger. Uh, Many times, Job, we talk about Job a lot, that he, he never that he didn't get angry. He was faithful. Yeah, Job was faithful, but Job got mad too. Job got angry. Job said, "I cursed the day I was conceived in my mother's womb." Jeremiah got angry with God. Jesus got angry with God. It's norm. It's in your human nature that anger is a part of grieving. But if I can be preacher again, but for the believer, Jesus gives you space to grieve. Jesus gives you space to grieve and be angry. But then you have to pull back on your faith, because Paul never said that you couldn't cry, but Paul did say, "Grieve as those that have, don't weep as those that have no hope." That yes, it's okay to cry and grieve and weep, but understand that believers, that Christians weep differently. And I hear you saying, "Preacher, that's good preacher talk." But again, I'm telling you, God does give us space to grieve. He gives us space to be angry, to ask questions, because He's big enough to handle it. He is big enough to handle it. If y'all want to drop some more questions in the chat, you can. But as of now, we're gonna. You
I
can
just
continue.
wanted to read something in reference to the woman that asked the question about being a widow. This is from a book called "The Cure for Sorrow," which I don't particularly like the the title, but I like the book a lot. It's a book of blessings, um, and this is entitled "The Blessing You Should Not Tell Me." Do not tell me there will be a blessing in the breaking, that it will ever be a grace to wake into this life so altered, this world so without. Do not tell me of the blessing that will come in the absence. Do not tell me that what does not kill me will make me strong, or that God will not send me more than I can bear. Do not tell me this will make me more compassionate, more loving, more holy. Do not tell me this will make me more grateful for what I had. Do not tell me I was lucky. Do not even tell me there will be a blessing. Give me instead the blessing of breathing with me. Give me instead the blessing of sitting with me when you cannot think of what to say. Give me instead the blessing of asking about him, how we met, and what I loved most about the life we shared. Ask for a story, or tell me one, because a story is finally the only place on earth he lives now. If you could know what grace lives in such a blessing, you would never cease to offer it. If you could glimpse the solace and the sweetness that abide there, you would never wonder if there was a blessing you could give that would be better than this, the blessing of your own heart opened and beating with mine.
I love it. I love it. Um, I took in undergrad. I took pastoral care and counseling in undergrad, and one of the most important things that has ever rested with me in that class is what you're saying now. A lot of times, when we go visit people who have just lost someone, or when preachers want to come, come to the house, or when people come to funerals, people try to find cliches to just throw at us. Let's be honest. When we're grieving, we ain't trying to hear that. I mean, they know me. I'm as real as I can be. I'm not trying to hear the cliches that you have to say. You said something about all the we I used to preacher say, God needed a flower in his garden. Well, why he got to mess with this garden? Why? I mean, make it make sense. Why he got to mess with this garden? We just think we have to say something, but we often forget that sometimes what people need is simply the ministry of presence. There's been times where I've went to parishioners' houses that have just lost somewhere, and I sat with them. I just cried. I cried with them. I shared with them. Because at that moment, nothing I say is going to make you feel any better in that moment. My heart is broken. I'm trying to see if I got any real folk that's going to comment on the screen. My heart is broken and bleeding, and you coming in here with these cliches trying to cover. No, I'm hurting. I'm broke. And so for pastors and leaders and people who your ministry is to go places and help people grieve, I get it. But sometimes just showing up, just being there, just let me cry on you for a minute. cry with me for a minute. Don't undervalue the ministry of you just being there. Because sometimes we say stuff and now I feel worse than when you showed up. You should have just stayed where you were. Don't walk into a room just trying to find the right answer to make people forget that they grieve it. No, let them grieve. And so I love it. I love the poem. You got to send that to me. I love it. I love it. Go ahead. You can continue. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
I'm acting like this my presentation.
No, that's fine. No, I wanted to just read that in reference to the woman that had shared earlier about what it's like to be a widow and see everyone else continue their life on whenever it feels like our life is halted abruptly. There's another book called Tear Soup that talks about that, talks about standing at the window and watching everything go by and trying to figure out how everyone's life can keep going whenever ours has stopped. One of the things that's really helpful for us whenever we're grieving is to integrate our person into our insides because they're not physically, externally here with us anymore. And we do that by what we talked about earlier, sharing stories with one another, what Jan talked about it in her blessing, just keeping them as vibrant and vital in our lives as we can going forward. We will never be the same after we have a significant death, after we have several significant deaths in our lives. We learn how to go forward, though.
I don't see any other questions. No one else has ever. Do you have any? You have more?
Well, I can read some more.
Yes. Go ahead.
So one of the things that's helpful to think about whenever we're grieving is knowing, like I said earlier, that the grief process is not a linear process. We can go through times where we've passed our season where we feel shock and numb and we're denying the death because it feels so unreal and so surreal. And then we begin to start feeling our pain, and that doesn't feel good. So then we start safeguarding. What that means, we'll begin to stay away from places that bring up the pain, that bring up triggers for us. Eventually, however, we will not be able to push the pain away forever, and we get into it. We slide into a deeper level of anguish and despair. And after that, it's like the old adage. It says the darkest is just before the dawn. The night is the darkest before the dawn. We will begin to have some healing. We will begin to find some renewal in our lives and begin to reconcile with the fact that our person has died and we're still alive and having to learn how to go forward. What's challenging for us is that we can ricochet all over the place. We can have different triggers and different things that can hit us from behind. One of my friends calls it ninja grief, where whenever we least expect it, something hits us and we feel like we've buckled over with our grief and our sadness. One of the things that is different after we've begun to have some healing and then we have a trigger, whatever it is that makes us feel like we're back at square one again, is that the level of intensity may feel really intense right then at the time of the trigger, but the time of recuperating afterwards will be less. So whenever we had a death in April, and we went through a long summer and then a long, long winter, and then we feel like we were starting to get our stride back. We were learning how to live life again, and something happened. And we feel like it knocked us way back to maybe the month after our person died. What's different about the trigger that far into our healing is that it won't take us so long to recuperate. It won't take us another 12 months before we're out of bed again or off the couch. We're not going to stay in bed for a whole week. We may stay in bed for a day because we've been really challenged by whatever trigger there was. And just know that those things do happen. One of the things that's helpful to think about in grief is that some people feel like our grief shrinks, but really what we do is we begin to grow a life around our grief. So the fact that our person died is not going to go away. The fact that we're sad that they're not living with us 20 years later, 10 years later, that's the intensity of it will lessen. Yes, it will. But we are building a life as well along the way. And I know that whenever grief is really, really fresh, we don't even want to build a life. It's not something that's appealing to us. We just are sad and we're lonely and we're grieving. And I just want to encourage you that putting one foot in front of the other, taking it one day at a time. My favorite life mantra personally is slow and steady wins the race. So there is just not a sprinting in grieving. It's a marathon experience, and it's going to take some time, and we take as long as it takes.
I really do like that because sometimes other people will tell us, "You still grieving?
Mm.
You should be over that by now." And so I love that. Like you said, again, everybody's different, but your race, your pace. That's what I want to leave you with tonight. Your race, your pace. Don't let people tell you how long you should grieve and when you should end. They're not running your race. They can't tell you your pace. So if you had a ending statement tonight, if you want to wrap it up, I mean, I have absolutely enjoyed this. We may have to come back with a part two in a couple of months. I mean, this is amazing. Well, what would be your final statement? Your final anything or what you want to close with?
I think I would just encourage you that that as hard as it feels when it's really, really fresh, it won't always feel that bad. It won't always feel that hard, and I still would go back to encouraging you that we can heal in community.
Wonderful, wonderful. Look, do me a favor. I know you're not in the sanctuary, but I'm going to turn the screen to her. Come on, give her some hearts, give her some thumbs up. Let's give her some virtual love. We are excited to have her here. So I want to see the hearts, I want to see the thumbs up. There we go, there we go. I love it, I love it. They're showing you all the love. Someone says, even after 10 years, first still come up, and the first of grandchildren, graduation, and so on. Another person said, uh, person, uh, she was, I had just been declared cancer free 120 after being through breast cancer and feeling physically strong. COVID hit. Uh, she wrestled with a lot. Then she lost her son suddenly. He was 42, grown with a wife and a son. And not only was I left without my son, I can't be selfish. He left a wife, son, siblings, family. So I wrestled that I could not be there. The rest of us could, yeah, she couldn't get there because of COVID. So,
It's
and
very common.
that was one thing that I wanted to make sure that we did, because with social distancing, I wanted us to come together even in this virtual space. Someone said this is helpful, extremely informative, much needed. They love you. They love you. And the local church and the community in the city of Nashville thanks Alive Hospice. On the bottom of the screen is some information. If you want that, there's the website, the phone number, and the email address. If you want to contact her, how can they contact you personally? Your personal email address, or can they just call the office and just ask for
Then
you?
yes, yes, yes.
Okay, yeah, just call the office, ask for Miss Yarbrough, and she will get you to the right person. Well, this wraps us up. Thank you all for joining us. Perhaps there was somebody that needed to hear this that could not. So, as I always say at the end, please share this if you did not do it. Somebody needs to do this. Somebody needs this message as you needed it tonight, because we're healing together. And this is not the last segment. There's going to be things coming to you because we want you healed and we want you whole. Well, until we meet again, God bless you. God keep you. God give you strength. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.